You probably know that Derek Chauvin was convicted of the murder of George Floyd. I think that conviction was wrong. I think the verdict was wrong. I think the jury went along with the tide of opinion. That's what I want to talk about, why the verdict was wrong, how I think it happened, why I think the jury went along with the general tide of opinion. I'd like to talk in future videos about what I think this means for America's immediate future, and then what I think it means for America's long-term future. But first, the Derek Chauvin verdict. I think that was the wrong verdict. Now, there were three charges: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. And to convict him, those jurors had to decide, or they did decide unanimously, apparently beyond reasonable doubt, that he committed all of those crimes. If I go through them one by one, the first, second-degree murder, in this instance, what that means is causing someone's death without intending the death of anyone while committing a felony. And I don't think that can apply, causing someone's death while committing a felony. I don't know what felony Derek Chauvin committed. The classic, what that's intended for is if you and I go and rob a bank and then someone gets shot dead whilst we're robbing the bank. That's the kind of felony situation we're talking about. Or if we go to mug someone, we stick a knife in their ribs and there's a bit of an altercation and then the person gets stabbed and dies. And we can say, well, we didn't mean to kill him, we just wanted his wallet. That would be second-degree murder. None of that. This was not that. And the reason I say that is mainly because kneeling on the neck was something that was prescribed, that was put forward as safe in the Minneapolis Police Handbook as a non-lethal restraint that police officers could use when dealing with non-cooperative suspects. So given that, it's difficult to see how can that be a felony if the police handbook to the policeman, to the cops, says you can use that hold, it's non-lethal. And so I don't see any way. I think it's beyond reasonable doubt that it wasn't second-degree murder. And similarly with third-degree murder, for that one you have to show that the defendant caused, without intent to affect the death of any person, causing the death of another by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life. Well, again, it needs to be eminently dangerous. I don't see how doing something that is put forward by your police handbook as a non-lethal restraint that you can use in the case of an uncooperative suspect, how that you might be able to argue that's dangerous. It may be dangerous. You can't then come back and say that is eminently dangerous, and you can't say that it evinces a depraved mind. To do that, you would have to say someone who follows the police manual, a policeman who follows a police manual is depraved. Well, they have a different manual. I don't see, and without regard for human life, again, if it's put forward as a non-lethal restraint, how can you say that he didn't, beyond reasonable doubt, that he didn't have regard for human life, particularly when they called the ambulance so early on in the arrest, because they could see that George Floyd was struggling. Now, second-degree manslaughter, that's the one that conservatives are coming out and saying, well, maybe it was manslaughter, it wasn't murder, it might have been manslaughter. This is the temptation when you're coming up against the tide of opinion, is to compromise middle of the road and say, well, okay, well, I'll grant you it might have been manslaughter. No. I don't think it was that either. This charge of manslaughter in this state was if by the person's culpable negligence, whereby the person creates an unreasonable risk and consciously takes chances of causing death or great bodily harm to another. Now, I think that is intended to catch the kind of case where I get high and get in my car and drive it into a crowd of people because I'm just being really reckless and someone gets killed. But again, this was not that. Was it culpable negligence? Well, again, if that is a prescribed an allowed, if the neck kneel is an allowable hold, an allowable restraint within the in the police manual, how can that be culpable negligence? And how can it be an unreasonable risk? How can that be Chauvin consciously taking chances of causing death or great bodily harm? If that is put forward by the police manual as something that police can use as a non-lethal restraint. And again, consciously taking chances of causing death or grievous or great bodily harm, that is not consistent with Chauvin and the other cops having called the ambulance so early on. So I don't think any of those charges were made out, but the jury convicted. They made a very fast decision within 10 hours and they didn't ask any questions of the judge. And that suggests to me they weren't picking over the evidence, because the strongest I think you can say about the case is that it was complicated. I think it was fairly simple that he wasn't guilty of any of those charges. But I think the best you can say is it's complicated and they would have needed to ask questions. I think they got the verdict wrong. I think it was wrong on the evidence. The reason I think it's wrong on the evidence was firstly because of the level of fentanyl in George Floyd's body. He was high on fentanyl. There's some debate. Some people saying he had enough in his body to kill a horse. I think the prosecution said the amount that was in his body was no more than is normally found in the bloodstream of someone who's using fentanyl. So it's a normal dose of fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate that is described, I think, on the Talk to Frank website as being between 50 and 100 times stronger than morphine. And its main effect, the way it kills you, is by stopping your breathing. You get so relaxed that your lungs stop working and you just suffocate. You stop breathing and dying, and you die. I think fentanyl was found in the back seats of the squad car, later with George Floyd's DNA over it. He was seen dropping a small bag of white powder by his side when he was arrested. So that there's the drugs that he was taking. It was also found that the coroner found that he had fentanyl, amphetamine and weed, cannabis, in his system when he was at the post-mortem. So then the heart blockages he had, those don't relate to breathing, but they do relate to the ability to get blood into your system, which that's why you breathe. You breathe it into your lungs, the blood then gets pumped around, your heart pumps that oxygen saturated blood around your body. And he had George Floyd had really serious narrowing restriction of his coronary arteries. The full coroner's report said that he had 75% proximal and 75% mid narrowing of the left anterior descending coronary artery. So on the left hand side, the artery that's going down feeding the heart, that was 75% narrowed in two parts, in the middle and the bit near the heart. And then 90% proximal narrowing of the right coronary artery, so the artery on the right hand side going into the heart, that was 90% constricted close to the heart. Now that is serious narrowing of those arteries. That really affects your ability to get oxygen around your body. That is going to kill you faster. I don't see how you can say beyond reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin actually did kill George Floyd. And George Floyd was resisting arrest. He wasn't just being uncooperative, he was resisting arrest. He was saying he couldn't breathe. I think he was saying it when he was in the squad car. When he was standing up, he asked to be put on the ground. He was talking before he died. And the rule of thumb, my understanding is that cops are taught that if someone can speak, they can breathe, because you need to pass wind over your vocal cords and able to breathe. And also the autopsy report showed that there was no damage to his windpipe, to George Floyd's windpipe, or to his neck arteries. So it doesn't seem to me possible to say that Derek Chauvin even caused George Floyd's death, let alone that he had the state of mind, the motivation, the intention of causing him death or serious harm, or that he was reckless about it. And kneeling on the neck is something that was described by the police handbook as being a non-lethal restraint. that you can use in the case of a suspect who's not cooperating. So I think the jury returned the wrong verdict. Why did they do it? Was it political pressure? Were they afraid? It's possible they did it out of fear because they saw the Daunte Wright riots when Daunte Wright, who got shot in the same city, whilst Derek Chauvin's trial was on. They saw the pretty violent demonstrations about George Floyd's death. All of the defence lawyers in that case, so the defence lawyer for Derek Chauvin and for the other cops, they all apparently reported receiving threats. My view is that the jury simply got carried away on the tide of opinion. They went with the flow, and it was very clear what the tide of opinion was before and after he was charged, before and after Chauvin was convicted. And I think they might have been a little bit motivated by fear of further riots, fear of reprisals, fear that they might get it in the neck. But I think mainly they just went along with the tide of opinion, as people do. They did come under pressure. The first one I'd like to show you is Maxine Waters. She's a congresswoman, quite a senior lady in the American Congress, and she was clear: we want guilty, 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 and if we don't get it, we're going to get more confrontational and show them that we know that we mean business. Now, what I'd like to do, if I just do this, you can see what there. If I show you that.
Now potentially affecting the case. Representative Maxine Waters.
There she is, Maxine Waters. Guilty, guilty, guilty.
Guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to get more.
If we don't get it, we're going to get more confrontational. Got to make sure they know that we mean business. Okay. Now, that was whilst the trial was on. That was before the jury is sequestered. In the UK, when someone's charged, basically you have to stop talking about the trial. The press have to stop talking about it because you could prejudice the trial. You can go to jail for contempt of court if you are expressing opinions about someone being guilty or innocent, if you're doing something that could compromise the trial. In the States, the way they do it is they try. In the States, the First Amendment ideal is of free speech at all times. You can say what you want, and that is elevated above the trial process, I think. And so the way that the states try to deal with those two conflicting ideals, free speech or safe and fair trials. In Britain, we say we preserve the sanctity of the justice system, and we postpone your right, or we temporarily suspend your right to talk freely about that trial whilst the trial is going on. I think that's uglier. I think it is better. I think we have a better system that way. In the States, the balance is the other way. They say, no, you still have your right to free speech, but when the jury go away to consider their verdict, they are what's called sequestered. They're isolated in a hotel room. They're pretty much denied all forms of outside contact. Maxine Waters said what she said whilst the trial was going on before the jury had been sequestered, so they could quite easily have seen it. What she was saying, we want a guilty verdict, we're going to get more confrontational. I think we know what she meant by that. Now, she wasn't the only person talking like that. You had another congresswoman, Cori Bush. Now, if I bring her up, Derek Chauvin's lawyers, hold on if you can see that, arguing that George Floyd does not deserve justice, Cori Bush. So Representative Cori Bush said on Tuesday that defence lawyers for Derek Chauvin are arguing that Floyd does not deserve justice, and she described the news cycle as a trauma. This is the quote. We all watched George Floyd get murdered, okay? He's on trial for murder. That hasn't been established. That's what she's saying. Basically saying everyone knows it was murder. And now for the next several weeks, the entire news cycle will be dominated by Derek Chauvin's defence lawyers arguing that George Floyd does not deserve justice. That's trauma. It's okay not to be all right. Now, what that looks like the height of hypocrisy. That looks like her saying that allowing Derek Chauvin to defend himself in court is an injustice, and that and she is saying that under the guise that Derek Chauvin's lawyers are saying that George Floyd doesn't deserve justice. What I think she is saying is that Derek Chauvin didn't deserve justice. And she should have. In the UK, if she spoke like that, she'd be in a lot of hot water. She'd be lucky to stay in Parliament talking like that. I think she'd be lucky not to go to jail, but especially on a case as serious as this. Then the one that I thought was in some ways less serious but really disgusting was Biden coming out. And Biden, if I show you this one, if you can see this, Biden says he's praying for a guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial. And now what he said, if I go down, I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think it's overwhelming in my view, he told reporters in the Oval Office. I wouldn't say that unless the jury was sequestered now, not hearing me say that. So what he's saying, okay, the jury's sequestered, they're isolated in their hotel rooms, they can't hear me say it, but I think the evidence is overwhelming and I'm praying. He is saying he's praying for a guilty verdict. That's incredibly out of order. That is disgusting for a president to say that, particularly on something where feelings are running so high. He should be saying, no, we need a fair trial, we need an impartial verdict. And what's so reckless is, well, the jury was sequestered at that time. He doesn't know they're going to be sequestered forever. Supposing they take weeks considering their verdict, which is foreseeable they might have done. They might well have been allowed time or telephone calls to talk to their family. It's possible. One of their relatives might have said to one of them, you know, the president, he thinks the evidence is overwhelming. He wants you to convict this guy. And how can he guarantee? Or supposing there was a mistrial and there had to be a retrial for they couldn't reach a verdict and they had a retrial, then everyone else would know your president wants a guilty verdict. That was incredibly irresponsible, and I think it was compounded by him and the Vice President, President Harris, having a big press conference immediately after the verdict was announced, saying what a good thing it was, basically saying they approved of it, it's the right verdict, and now we're going to do this, that and the other. Well done, jury, you came to the right verdict. I think that's the message they were sending. And from an English point of view, that's completely unthinkable. I find it's really, really disgusting. It's showing, talk about a lack of, America is supposed to pride itself on its separation of powers. There was no separation of powers there. I think that old Biden should be thoroughly ashamed of that. That is a bad day for American justice. They're basically saying our ideals, our ideology, they can wash over the court process, and we don't mind that happening. I think that is what happened. I think America is prone to that because I think America is a nation built on ideals, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and America prides itself, I think, on being based not on ethnicity or race, but on ideals. And I think what we're going to find is what we found time and again in the past, that you cannot base a nation on ideals. It is a very poor, shaky foundation. It's also contradictory. Nation, the word nation comes from it has the same root as the word nativity, meaning birth, the birth line that gives rise to a nation. A nation is associated with birth, effectively with ethnicity, not with ideals. The French, during the French Revolution, tried to outdo the American Revolution in this respect, trying to be even more ideals based on the ideals of virtue and liberty, particularly virtue, the Republic of Virtue. And it quickly those ideals descended into terror and massacre. And similarly with the Soviet Union, basing itself on its wonderful utopian ideals, which never got off the ground really, just always included massacre and atrocity, and showed how ideals can be perverted and turned on their heads. So you'll say liberty, freedom, that's a fundamental ideal. There are people out there who threaten that ideal of freedom. They need to have terror struck into their hearts. And to do that, we're going to create an atmosphere of terror for everyone. And therefore, in order to preserve your freedom, we're going to make sure you live in a state of permanent terror. That's the kind of way that those ideals can get turned on their heads. What I think happens in America, what I think is happening in America is people say, We are based. Obama, he was a devil for always saying that the ideals we're based on. That's not who we are. We are our ideals. And if you say that you are your ideals, then you are prone. If a lot of other ideas, a lot of other ideology comes up very strongly, you will inevitably find yourself. You'll have to say that the founding ideals within the Constitution must be infused with these wonderful new ideas, these new ideals, these Me Too anti-racist ideals that you've discovered that are sweeping the nation like a tidal wave. And therefore they must form part of the founding ideals in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. And therefore they must form part of our foundation, part of our existence, part of who we are. And the institutions that emanate from that Constitution, like the courts, they must be subject to our ideals, these wonderful Me Too anti-racist ideals that we've discovered. And there is evidence, I think that is what is happening in America. That is why I think this trial and other trials have been so bad, and I think it is going to get worse, because America is going to say, we are our ideals, and if we are our ideals, those ideals, the ideals we base ourselves on, must be really, really good ideals. They must therefore be in line with these new ideas we've come up with. And I think we saw this, I think this began a few years ago with the Me Too movement. Not so badly as in the Chauvin trial, I don't think, but still very unpleasantly. In two cases I'd like to talk about very briefly. One is the Larry Nassar, the other is Harvey Weinstein. You've heard of Harvey Weinstein. Larry Nassar was a doctor who worked for the women's USA gymnastics team, or he was supposedly the doctor treating those teenage girls. He conducted over many years, I think decades, a series of really horrible sexual assaults against those teenage girls who were just sort of desperately ambitious, wanting to make it as gymnasts on the USA team. And what the picture that's painted in the reports is very difficult to tell, it's very difficult to tell if they're true. The picture that's painted is of a dysfunctional environment where he was able to pose as Mr. Nice Guy and then carry out his assaults and tell these girls that these were medical treatments he was doing. This was cold, calculating, practiced, devious, treacherous sexual assault. A terrible, very long series of offences. But so you don't have to have sympathy for him, but the justice system, you don't have to have sympathy for him to say that the justice system should not drag itself down into the fray, into the mud, I would say. I think that's what happened with Larry Nassar at his sentencing. He pleaded guilty, and the sentencing hearing, it looked to my eye a bit like not so much like a courtroom. You imagine the English courtroom with the custard-faced old judge who's like a snob, aloof, doesn't care about ordinary people, what ordinary people think, might despise ordinary people. His pride is giving impartial, infallible verdicts. He wants to be impartial, he wants to get it right. He doesn't care what you think. He's probably wearing women's underwear under his robes anyway, and he's a degenerate in his personal life. That doesn't matter. But he is focused. He doesn't want sympathy from anyone. He's not on anyone's side. And that is not what happened here. You had a lot of very strong evidence against Larry Nassar, some horrible offending. And what that custard-faced English judge would say is the stronger the evidence and the more abhorrent the allegation, the more important it is to make sure the defendant gets a fair trial and to make sure that that evidence is considered impartially. I remember that being said to me by a very nice judge, Judge Mardo, many decades ago, and he was right. But if you look at what happened in Larry Nassar's sentencing, you're allowed what's called victim statements. You sometimes get those in English cases, but this judge allowed 156 of those victim statements. I think they took 5 days to get through. And there was a lot of hugging and applause and crying with it, and people congratulating each other for a wonderful victim statement they'd given within the courtroom. And the judge also congratulating people for their statement as well. It was really, it looked consciously and deliberately biased and prejudiced, almost as if it was proud to be prejudiced against this defendant who has not yet been sentenced. I just want to show you a little video of this judge getting interviewed, and you'll get some flavour of it. Now, if I do this again, now if you see that's a judge. If I go back to the start now.
Certainly changed over the past year for Judge Rosemarie Aquilina.
Now, if you see, that is the judge. It's after she sentenced that guy. She seems to have become a bit of a celebrity as a result of it. It strikes me as a little bit like the Rolling Stones sentencing after the Stones drug busting. Was it 66, 67? It's out of order, but then hear what she's got to say.
Don't get
a
to the
national
grocery
sensation
store
yeah.
as quickly because people stop me all the time.
And what do they say?
Thank you. And probably 90% of them say, me too. And they hug me. Some people cry. And they all...
Yeah, she's talking very proudly about people come up to her in the supermarket. They congratulate her. They thank her.
have a story. And many of them were not believed.
The outspoken Michigan judge became an overnight sensation when she lambasted USA Gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar at...
Now, if you see that look she's giving him for the camera, I think that is her saying, I don't like you. I want to show people that I'm prejudiced against you. That's the way that looks to me.
his sentencing.
I wouldn't send my dogs to you, sir.
He'd gotten away with it for a long time.
Nobody listened. If one person would have listened 30 years ago, hundreds of girls would have been spared.
She decided to allow...
There, it's not good. When she tells him, I wouldn't send my dog to you. I mean, he was a doctor. I wouldn't send my dog to you. I mean, it's really... he had committed terrible offending. That is irrelevant to whether or not the court remains impartial, as the court should. I don't think it was right for the court to behave the way it did. That was a worrying sign that I saw then. And then the other one is the Harvey Weinstein case. He was subjected to mass condemnation way before he got charged, way before he got tried, and even during the trial. And as a result of it, I think that case was his case. I thought at the time he's not going to get a fair trial. He said, for what it's worth, he seems like a really unpleasant, exploitative bully to me. Very skilled, very intelligent, very practiced, very calculating. A user and a bully. But again, I don't know the guy. I can only base it on the reports I've seen. That is irrelevant to whether or not he gets a fair trial. I don't see how his trial can be described as fair. What you had, for instance, was, I think at his trial there were 2 women alleging assault or rape, and 4 other women who were not alleging abuse as part of this trial, or their allegations were not on trial. They were able to come into the court and to say, yeah, he abused me as well. I don't know how that can be allowed, because that seems to me to be purely prejudicial. The only way, in an English court, basically the only way you can allow that is if there is some really peculiar identifying MO, that this, a bit like a thumbprint, that the defendant uses. And you can see how he's used this standard procedure that's peculiar to him alone, and he's used it on previous occasions. That will be evidence of similarity. You can sometimes bring that, but that can't just be the stock in trade. You can't simply say, he abused me as well, so he must be guilty of another offence. You can't sentence someone on their character. You can't convict someone on their character. You convict them on the evidence. And by bringing other women in saying, he did it to me as well, me too, then you're going to you risk. He's going to get convicted on the character that's established by those other women. I don't see how it's possible he could have got a fair trial with 4 other women coming in saying, yep, he did it to me as well. And that is what's called more prejudicial than probative. And he also, another thing that I think was unfair and strikes me as just a bit weird, is that he said his whole defence was, these women consented. I never did anything without consent. And he produced affectionate emails and communications, and I think texts as well, from the women who alleged that he'd abused them, where they'd written to him, I think, some months, even I think possibly years afterwards, telling him that their affection for him, how much they liked him, basically sending him affectionate emails for a long time after the alleged offence. And he was advancing this as evidence of consent. And a feminist professor was brought in to say, no, there are loads of different reactions that women might have to being assaulted, and none of them can be assumed to be evidence of consent. Doesn't matter how affectionate, it doesn't matter if they appear to be going along with it, there's no evidence at all. Basically saying nothing that the woman does afterwards can be shown as, can be produced to show evidence that she might have consented at the time. So it's impossible, basically saying it's impossible for a man to produce any evidence as to what has happened afterwards to show evidence of consent. That really makes it very difficult, probably in a lot of cases impossible, for a man to prove his innocence. I don't know why that was imposed on Weinstein at that trial. It seems grossly unfair. What you also had was a lot of evidence brought, really just rotten, highly prejudicial evidence designed to humiliate him, to make him seem a bit less than human. It seems, talk about how ugly he was, how fat he was, how he was impotent, his abnormal appearance, how he appeared just strange and physically weird, and that again is more prejudicial than probative. That doesn't prove anything about whether or not he assaulted someone. That seems to me, and that should never have been allowed. I think that was Weinstein getting the unfair hearing. You might say, well, he deserved it. That's not the issue. The issue is the court system needs to be fair. It needs to be impartial. If you want to watch more of that, then I'd suggest you watch a very good video about that trial by a lady called Janice Fiamengo. She's an Ottawa retired professor of English literature at Ottawa University, and that's if I show you there, hold on, that's the Me Too trial of the century, the Fiamengo file, episode 113. Very good. She does a good job. Okay, so now I think the problem is, as I've said, that America is a nation of ideals, and that is a problem. And that means that America will be susceptible to other very strong idealistic notions sweeping the nation, because they will have to see their founding ideals as being infused with these new ideas that have just been discovered, but which have such a grip on everyone, as I think they do. And I think the Chauvin jury was very susceptible to that. Now, that isn't just me saying it. It's not me trying to bash America. For what it's worth, I find Americans always very nice to me. But so I like America. I like American people. But I think that America is doing something really bad with its justice system, and I think America's going to find that's really dangerous. That is worse than restrictions on freedom of speech, or temporary restrictions on freedom of speech. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of Americans who are on the other side who wanted Derek Chauvin convicted. There are three of them I refer to. And Professor Jason Johnson, he's a professor of journalism at an American university, I forget which one. Al Sharpton, the Reverend Al Sharpton, you might have heard of him. And Nancy Pelosi, I think she's the Speaker in Congress. But first I'll deal with Jason Johnson. What he said is that basically there has to be a year's worth of protests in order to get one scintilla of justice. If I play this.
I don't have any sense of satisfaction. I don't think this is a system working. I don't think this is a good thing. What this says to me is that in order to get a nominal degree of justice in this country,
in order to get a nominal degree of justice, I think he's referring to the verdict there.
Viewed by the entire world, there have to be a year's worth of protests.
There have to be a year's worth of protests.
Officers to tell one white officer that he was wrong in order to get one
scintilla of justice. So he said it. What I think he's saying there is it would have been, if it hadn't been for a year's worth of protests, it would have been a not guilty verdict. That's what I think he's saying. He said it. Okay, the next one is the Reverend Al Sharpton. So if I go to him now here, and there is he pulls such faces, Al Sharpton. Okay, So Al Sharpton on the Derek Chauvin guilty verdict. Right.
We would have rather George be alive. Amen. But we celebrate that because young people, white and black.
Because young people,
some
white and black,
castigated,
some
many that
castigated,
marched and kept marching.
and kept going.
Many of them looked down on, but they kept marching and wouldn't let this die. And this is an assurance to them that if we don't give up, that we can win some rounds. But
We can win some rounds.
war and the fight is not over.
But the war and the fight is not over. Okay? So he sees it. I think he's saying it's like a boxing match, and you have to do a lot of marching in order. And the Chauvin conviction was like one round in the boxing match, and you have to do a lot of marching in order to win that round. I think that's what he's saying. Okay, mixing his metaphors, but anyway. Now, so that's the final one is Nancy Pelosi. She ought to know better. So here she is. If you can see that.
His song. So again, thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice.
Sacrificing your life
For
for justice.
being there to call out to your mom. How heartbreaking was that? Call out for your mom. I can't breathe. But because of you, and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice. And now,
Okay, so George Floyd's name will always be synonymous with justice because of all those people who came out, millions of people all around the world. I think she's saying all those demos, all the activism got Chauvin convicted. Okay, so they're saying it. It's not just people like me who are saying that, so the hate mongers like me. No, it's the people on the other side. I think they're the hate mongers. They're saying, to hell with the system of justice. The system of justice is going to do what we tell it to. And I think that happened on this occasion. Because the mood around this case is, I think, it's extreme. The grip, the PC, anti-racist, I think hysteria is not too strong a word. It has got a grip on America. And again, you see the way that Biden, for him to come out whilst the jury are considering and to basically say what the right verdict is, and he's praying for a particular verdict, and then immediately the verdict is delivered to hold a press conference saying, well done fellas, right verdict. That is, it's so well, improper would be the constitutional word to use for it. It's just, it's wiping the impartiality of the system in the mud. And this is not new. It's not new that people get carried along on a tide of opinion. It's called the bystander effect, sometimes pluralistic ignorance. You can look these things up, herd mentality and confirmation bias, all these kind of things. People go with the flow. People run with the herd. And it happened under McCarthyism, and it's similar now, but I think it will get worse than it was under McCarthyism. Now, I want to show, I want to talk a little bit about, to compare this a little bit with McCarthyism. But first I want to show the strength of opinion. There's an Ipsos poll which I want to bring up. If I do this again, you'll see the Ipsos poll. And that's this one there. Ipsos public poll findings and methodology. America approves of the Chauvin guilty verdict. New Ipsos snap poll for USA Today finds most accept the verdict. So this is the tide of opinion in America. So, as you may know, Derek Chauvin was recently found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. Do you think this is the correct verdict? And then all respondents, they break it down, Dems and Democrats, Republicans and others. But all respondents, 71% think he's guilty, 13% think he's not guilty, 15% don't know. I think that 15% ought to be, in a rational world, that would probably be about 80 or 85% would say, listen, I didn't hear the evidence. I don't really know. I leave it up to the court. That's the best place to decide it. Let the jury hear the evidence in peace and quiet. But if you take the don't knows out of it, then what you've got is about 5.5 times the number of people think he was guilty than think he was not guilty. So 71 is about 5.5 times 13. That is a huge tide of opinion. I mean, and no party would ever dream of getting 71% of the vote at an election. Well, they might do in a dictatorship under Saddam Hussein or someone. But that is a very strong tide of opinion, and I think that's what the jury got carried along with. And I referred to McCarthyism a few minutes ago. That happened. I think that happened under McCarthyism. I think there was a strong tide of opinion there as America woke up to the threat of communist infiltration, which I think was going on. But again, the fact that communist infiltration went on doesn't mean that the methods and occasional hysteria that was employed, or occasional persecution that was employed under McCarthyism was right. No, it just wasn't. One of the main effects that you had under McCarthyism was that people who were charged, people who got fingered, couldn't get lawyers, they couldn't get witnesses to act for them. And the same happened with Derek Chauvin's trial. His lawyer, Eric Nelson, he was reported to have had tremendous trouble finding witnesses who would act, who would speak up and give evidence in favour of Derek Chauvin. And I think that's understandable. What you had was, what you've had since then is those cops getting, is those witnesses who acted for, who gave evidence for Derek Chauvin, getting the names trashed. There was one fella, a Dr. Fowler, Dr. David Fowler. He was a former ex-medical examiner, basically somebody who does post-mortem examinations. His entire record is now going to be examined because he spoke up in defence of, he gave evidence on behalf of Derek Chauvin. Now, if I show you this again, I'll show you this article. There, Maryland to probe cases handled by ex-medical examiner who testified in Chauvin trial. Maryland officials will conduct an independent review of reports of deaths in police custody during the tenure of retired Chief Medical Examiner Dr. David Fowler, representative from the offices of the Governor and Attorney General, confirmed to NPR on Saturday. Now, Fowler served as Chief Medical Examiner from 2002 to 2019. He was in the spotlight as a defence witness in the trial of former Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of murder and manslaughter charges this week in the death of George Floyd. Fowler testified that he believed Floyd had died of a sudden cardiac event due to his underlying heart disease while being restrained by police, citing multiple possible contributing factors such as drugs in the system and potential exposure to carbon monoxide from the vehicle exhaust. And Fowler argued the manner of death should be classified as undetermined. That seems very middle of the road, not excessively strong evidence. That seems really quite an impartial analysis of it from what I can tell. And yet, what's going to happen to him is he is going to get his record crawled all over. But that's not because his record is in doubt. It's because he gave evidence in defence of Derek Chauvin. And what I think the message that is sending is, we're going to crawl over your record. We're going to try and get something on you because we don't like the fact that you stood up for someone unpopular. That is no wonder, or that enhances those reports that I've read online that Chauvin's lawyers couldn't find people to speak up in defence of him during his trial. Similarly, you have someone else, Mr. Broad, a use of force expert. If I just bring up this case, if you can see this, that there. Pig's head and blood smeared on former home of Chauvin defence witness who said George Floyd's death was accidental. Well, so I think that sends a message. So what that says is how far the tide of opinion has gone, and people are going to go along with the tide of opinion. People are going to fear that. But what I really want to show here is just to illustrate how far the tide of opinion has gone. I want to show you what I think looks to me to be quite an extraordinary case reported in Sky News. Okay. Now, if I just bring this up here, pardon sought for George Floyd on drugs arrest by suspected corrupt officer charged over double murder. So what you read that and you think, gosh, George Floyd was really getting persecuted. I bet this was another white officer who also happens to be a murderer. And poor George Floyd, I always knew he was innocent. What this is about is this guy, Gerald Goins, and he arrested George Floyd in 2004, and Floyd pleaded guilty to possession of drugs. And this fella's apparently, what happened with him is that he and a team of vice cops, they appear to have, they conducted a raid on what they said was a drug dealing house, and the white couple who lived there got shot dead. And that cop appears, the allegation is that he fabricated the evidence to gain the search warrant. So he said he'd been told by an unnamed informant that informant had bought drugs, heroin, at that property. The judge, on the basis of that, the judge gives, on the basis of that false evidence, the judge provides a warrant for them to go in on what's called a no-knock drugs raid, where you just you break down the door and you go in. And what happened was the husband and wife inside got shot dead, and the autopsy on the wife found she had no drugs in her system. On the husband, there was found to be some traces of cannabis, weed. He'd smoked weed at some time, and the drugs in the house that were found in the house was a very small amount, apparently a really tiny amount of cocaine, I forget how much, and 8 grams of weed, 8 grams of grass, and that's personal possession amounts, and no heroin, none of the trappings of drug dealing. And yet, on the basis of that cop had his record crawled over, and all of his 1,400 previous his convictions that he secured are now going to be probably, it looks like they'll get overturned, because it's found that it's alleged that he did this sort of thing repeatedly. And the question is being asked, why did he need 10 officers to go to the property? Why did they fire through the walls of the property? Why did this couple, who don't appear to have been drug dealers, well, there appears to be no evidence, so far as we can tell, that they were drug dealers. Why did they end up dead? Now, what I want to look at is the different ways that this case has been treated. This man, Gerald Goins, he appears to have been, the allegation, if the allegation is correct, he is a far, far worse rogue cop, much more corrupt, much more violent, much more deliberate and calculated about it, with a much longer history of that corruption than Derek Chauvin was even alleged to have been. And yet, as far as Sky News are concerned, the important part about what he has done is not this white couple who've been shot dead, but the fact that George Floyd's guilty plea to possession of drugs might get overturned now, or should get overturned. Now, there are other ways that this case was treated as completely differently. For instance, if I show you this next one here, if you can look at this case, the widow of the former of the mayor for Houston, that's the town where this police officer operated, defended the integrity of that officer who led the botched raid. She said, comes a day that the former First Lady of Houston is defending the officer at the centre of the investigation. I want people to know there's another side to Gerald Goins, she said. He is a fine police officer who would only want to do something that is right. The great thing about Gerald is that he didn't bring one job to another. When he was with us, he focused on us. He didn't talk about anything he was doing. But I know him as a man of great integrity and honour. Do you think that a former First Lady of Minnesota would have said that about Derek Chauvin? There's no way. So And then the police officers union, who were silent about Derek Chauvin, I don't think they said anything to help him or to defend him. They came out swinging in favour of Gerald Goins, and what they said was, hold on, if I go through it, they said, enough is enough. Enough is enough. If you're the ones out there spreading the rhetoric that the police officers are the enemy, well, just know we've all got your number now. We're going to be keeping track on all of you all, and we're going to make sure to hold you accountable every time you stir the pot on our police officers. That was the police officers union in defence of this gentleman, Gerald Goins. Okay, a completely different reaction. And quotes, "It is not a reflection of the 5,200 brave men and women on the Houston Police Department." None of that has been said at all in the Minnesota case, in the Derek Chauvin case. And then, "We are sick and tired of dirtbags taking our lives." That police officers union came out swinging. And the Houston Council, they have voted, instead of using their own in-house lawyers, they have voted to hire very expensive lawyers to defend this case. I think it's a 7-figure sum. The council had been set to hire Beck Redden LLP for a 7-figure sum. 7 figures is somewhere between $1 and $9 million. So they're going out of their way to defend, it looks like, to defend Gerald Goins. So, or to defend them, well, to defend themselves against allegations about misconduct by him. Now, the thing about that Gerald Goins case is that with each review, a pattern seemed to emerge of citizens being detained and charged in false circumstances. That is what is being alleged. Now, you could not get, you couldn't get 2 cases handled differently. I had to dig pretty deep into this case to find out about the 2 people who got murdered. The 2 people who ended up dead, and that Gerald Goins is now charged with murdering in a corrupt raid. And nothing about it. The only thing is that perhaps George Floyd might have pleaded guilty to something he wasn't guilty of. That is a sign of how overwhelming this anti-racist ideology has become. I think it's completely out of touch with reality. I think it's accelerating. I think it will get worse. And in the next couple of videos, I'd like to talk about what the short-term outlook is for America and what the long-term outlook, what it means for the long-term outlook as well. Thank you.